On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, container lines make record profits. Who pays? Hi, I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to this episode of What's Going On with Shipping. If you're new to the channel, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. So this episode is going to be a follow-on to the story done by Rachel Premack. Rachel over at FreightWaves had the most popular article, Giant Container Ships Are Ruining Everything in the History of FreightWaves, most read. And as the most read article, it got a lot of positive and negative criticism about it. Well, she has followed up with that with interview of a special guest, Olaf Merck. And Olaf is kind of what she called right here, the big boat disrespecter. He's the Paris-based administrator for ports and shipping at the International Transport Forum of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OCED. And Olaf has written a series of pieces, which are linked in the article dating back to 2015 on mega ships, mega alliances, subsidy, shipbuilding, really a interesting person to interview. Now, obviously, Olaf has an interpretation of what's going on with ships. If Rachel had interviewed somebody from the World Shipping Council, probably get a different view. And what I want to do is go through the questions that she asked Olaf, Olaf's responses, and then add my own kind of analysis in here. So let's go ahead and take a look at this story. So this is Rachel's original story back on May 19th. Giant container ships are ruining everything. We can blame the big boat era for many of our supply chain headaches. And as I mentioned before, it got a lot of controversy surrounding it. Well, she followed up with this piece here on June 2nd, how we all paid for the shipping giants $150 billion windfall. Now, $150 billion, that is the profits that the major container liners made in 2021. Goes on here, we are footing the bill for ocean carrier profits even as the service gets worse. And she talks here again about Olaf and his backgrounds. And what she did is she asked a series of questions to him. And I'm just going to highlight some of them and again, add some comments here. So the very first one, through the 2010s, ocean carriers continued to build larger and larger ships, even as ocean rates and trade volumes were falling. What motivated this? And Olaf's response is, I think that was the choice of one carrier, Maersk, to use an even bigger class of ships and kind of as a weapon to get some of their competitors out of the market. It is about a slightly lower cost, but I also think that many competitors would not be able to follow that race to even bigger ships. I agree. I talked about in the original piece that when Maersk introduced the Emma Maersk in 2006, that was a radical change. But the even bigger change was in 2013 with the Triple E. When the Triple E came in, that vessel at 18,000 boxes was the game changer. And understand, Maersk did a full court press when it came to that ship. There's a discovery special that's done on it from the building to the construction. They invited press out to go view that vessel when it was being built in Korea. They even built the Lego ship back here so that you can buy Lego of it. It was a full court press on the Maersk Triple E. And it was intended, again, it comes out in 2013. This is after the 2008 cargo recession following the housing crisis. And it was intended to force other carriers to get into a shipbuilding competition with them. And it was successful. You see entities like Hanjin, for example, fall out. And we'll talk about that impact here as we go in. So I think Olaf makes a good point here. Next, the question that Rachel asked, some of my piece touch on the clash between ships getting larger and larger, even as ports, especially in the US, might not be keeping up. What is happening from an international perspective? Do megaships become more economical if ports keep up in size and innovation? And Olaf's answer was pretty straightforward. Well, I don't think they would be economical if ocean carriers needed to pay for the adjustments in ports and terminals. The fact is they don't. So that is why it has been economical so far. That is true. Ocean carriers build bigger and bigger ships. The ports, which are run by national, state, and local entities, have to adjust to accommodate these vessels. And if they don't adjust, if they don't accommodate, then the ocean carriers go somewhere else and they leave that port high and dry. Classic example, Boston, where Boston kind of lost out in ships coming into it. They eventually do develop it, but it's long behind. Wilmington, North Carolina, another perfect example of a port that didn't dredge, didn't really accommodate the larger vessels, and they kind of get left behind. And it's this investment that's really important. He goes on here to say, let's say the biggest ships were intended to go between Asia and Northwest Europe. All the focus has been on these ports and how they adjusted dredging in Hamburg, Antwerp, and the EU port extensions brought to them. But all ports are seeing the effects of bigger ships. If you have mega ships in Europe, they also go trans-Pacific. That means that also in North America, you will see the need to upgrade ports. And we have. We've seen that. You've seen it with the arrival of ships like the CMA CGM Ben Franklin. Did a video on that. Again, you can see it up above here. And the arrival of the Marco Polo, another massive vessel that came in. And again, U.S. ports have to accommodate that, even though there are issues associated with it. Next big subject here, shipping giants play global ports against each other for better infrastructure and avoid footing the bill. Could you talk a little bit more about how this plays out in the developing areas of the world outside of Europe and North America? And Olaf makes a very interesting point in Latin America. We looked at the ports of Buenos Aires in Argentina and some other Latin American ports. What we found there is they didn't do a lot of adaptations to the port. In that case, it was more the carriers that actually adapted some of their ships to the specific ports or the shallow depth of some of the ports. They actually develop a specific Latin American ship for that route. If you look at Maersk, for example, they have a subsidiary called Hamburg Sud, which they bought, basically operates the Latin American routes for them. Their ships are smaller, able to get in these ports. Now, I will caveat something that Olaf says here. I think it does put the ports at a disadvantage. They are paying more per box, per handling for the smaller ships than the bigger ships. And that's an issue that could have an impact in the overall economic development of the port and the countries. So that's a very important element to be factored into this. Going on here, Rachel asks, it reminds me of an issue in the US where we see various small counties and towns, especially in most rural America, will offer these major subsidies for Amazon to build a fulfillment center in their town, in their municipality. We've seen that multiple areas where states throw money at companies to bring them in. And in many ways, ports do the same exact thing here with shipping companies, and Olaf mentions that. It is indeed, I think, a comparable mechanism to your point about Amazon and the different states, with the difference that this is probably not a monopoly, but an oligopoly, which is true. It's not a single company. Amazon is Amazon. You really don't have a lot of competition against Amazon. But in this case, you have 9 large container liners controlling about 83% of the world's container capacity in 3 alliances. Moving on here, this is a great chart that she has in here from McKinsey showing the growth of container ships, the max size about 3,000 TEU in 1981, jumping to about 15,000 in 2006 with the Emma Maersk, jump up here to almost 18,000 in 2013 with the Triple E's, and then in 2010 the 24,000 mark with the introduction of the ultra large container vessels. But going on here, I want to jump ahead here and keep moving. China wanted to push back on megaships, but the European Commission wasn't interested in chatting. She goes on here, China wasn't sure that megaships was a good idea. At that moment, the European Commission could have reached an agreement and maybe altered or maybe even put some sort of stop to these ships getting bigger and bigger. You should note, if you look at the largest container ships in the world, those over 20,000 boxes, almost all the major carriers are investing in them, with the exception, and I shouldn't say exception, but with minor elements of Costco and OOCL investing in those large ships. They do not have a lot of them. They really don't. For the size of their container lines, remember, Costco and OOCL is combined together under Costco, 3rd largest container liner in the world. But they do not invest in the really big container ships. They have not gotten on the bandwagon of these massive ones. It's HMM, it's Evergreen, it's Maersk. Even Maersk hasn't really done it that much, to tell you the truth. It's Hauppauge, it's MSC. That's where you see it being done. And you notice it here. That was at the point when China and Costco in China didn't really invest in the larger ships. Some of the ports, like the port of Shanghai, was saying, well, actually, the ideal ship for our port is the 14,000 TEU ship. I went also to some of the meetings with some Chinese officials, and there was really a kind of newer view on some of these megaships. I don't think that's changed much. It was the European Commission that really pushed this. The fact that the European Commission didn't seem to be interested in discussing this. They thought, well, it's actually the European carriers that started all this, and it is in their interest. That is, I think, how they perceive the discussion. Again, there are meetings between the European Commission, China, and the Federal Maritime Commission. And it would have been really interesting to see if the FMC, the European Commission, and China, what would they have said? And listen, we're not going to adjust our ports to handle a vessel larger than X. 18,000 TEU, the Maersk Tripoli, that's as big as we want. We're not going to handle port ships bigger than this. Build accordingly. And that wasn't done. And instead, the push for bigger and bigger ships continued to happen. Goes on here. The three big ocean alliances are also allying with each other. It seems like an essential issue here is that the ocean carriers of the world are aligned, but none of the ports are. The carriers can work together in some ways, but the ports are in the race to the bottom. Olaf says there are some ports in some parts of the world that have actually merged, such as Seattle-Tacoma, SeaTac. That's exactly true. And actually, if you look at some states work to unify their ports together. So for example, in California, Oakland, LA, and Long Beach are municipal ports. They're run by the cities. But in Georgia, it's Georgia ports. It's Savannah is part of Georgia ports. In North Carolina, Morehead City and Wilmington is part of North Carolina ports. In Virginia, it's Virginia ports. It goes on here. Recently in Belgium, you got Antwerp and Zeebrugge that have merged. There is a bit of a movement there, but of course it is much less than what happens in ocean shipping. What is generally underestimated is the extent to which ocean carriers incorporate not only in alliances, which is one thing, but also across alliances. This is what we found in a recent study where we looked at all corporation agreements between the large carriers. This also includes vessel sharing agreements, or consortia, as we call them in Europe. All right, let's be clear about a couple of things here. So it's mentioned later, and I'm going to talk about it in a separate video, but the Federal Maritime Commission just completed a fact-finding study about whether or not container alliances and container companies basically operated together to set rates during COVID. And this comes up. But it's important to note that you're hearing a lot from some ports sitting there saying, well, LA and Long Beach are talking about this, that the number of ships coming into their ports are rising in terms of independence. In other words, the ocean alliances are not as big as they once were. You got to be careful about that. So you'll hear the Port of LA and the Port of Long Beach talk about the fact that there are new liners coming into their ports than ever before, a huge increase. Companies like Express Feeder coming in, CU lines, SM lines. But when you start looking at them, they are really tiny percentages of the overall shipping around the world. They are not a lot. Again, CU lines represents what, 0.3% of the world's container capacity. SM 0.3%. They're really tiny. And what you'll hear is that the independents are coming in larger percentage than the alliances. This is from the Port of LA. This is their March 2022 shipping line and services and port rotations by alliances. And you'll see right here the services provided at the Port of LA. This is provided by the Ocean Alliance. There are a series of routes with containers and the routes they operate on. There's the Alliance group. Right there, you see the Alliance group. And then you see the 2M group. So those are the three major alliances that operate in the Port of LA. But then you have the independents. But when you look at the independents, you got to be very careful about this, because the independents are made up of shipping lines that are part of alliances. So for example, Maersk operates a line that is independent of the 2M alliance, but it's still Maersk. Same thing with CMA, CGM, same thing with MSC and ONE. Really, the only separate one you have here is ZIM, and then those lifts of opportunity by lines like CU, SM, Express, they're coming in. So when they sit there and say, listen, there are more independents than ever before in these routes, you got to be really careful. The oligopoly that is the three alliances control a lot on the Trans-Pacific, Trans-Europe routes. And that's what we're seeing happen. And so he talks about the port alignments. Man, I keep hopping on this with ports. The fact that the Maritime Administration controls the port infrastructure grant should be a golden opportunity to create a port strategy for the United States. Instead, what we're seeing is ports competing against other ports. And that is a terrible way for the United States to exist. Go on here. We, the taxpayers, have been unwittingly paying for worse and worse ocean shipping service. Completely true. If you look at the reliability rates of ships and services coming in, they've decreased tremendously. One of the consistent things we've seen is the reliability of the big ocean carriers, which was about 70% pre-COVID, just cataclysmically fall down to about 30-40%. And again, that's the thing, and that happens in freight all the time, is when demand goes up and rates go up, the service goes down. Rachel asked this question. So there are not just the three big alliances, but also the three big alliances even have an alliance among each other. I think that we can agree on the surface that when we see this lack of competition, it immediately strikes most people as harmful and maybe something that we should avoid for customer welfare and others. Olaf goes on that point, yes, they might need this form of cooperation, but that is also because they wanted these big ships. There essentially is no need for alliances if ships were much smaller. I don't know if I agree with that part about Olaf. I'm going to say that. The reason why we have these alliances and why we have the forms of cooperation is because the ships have gotten so much bigger. The alliances predate the big ships. And in particularly, the alliances were initially, go back to the 1990s. They were formed by smaller companies to compete against the bigger ones. And I'm going to disagree just a bit with him on this. And he says, imagine a situation in which instead of 24,000 TEU ships, we have 10,000 TEU ships. Then it's much easier for a single carrier to offer one global network of connections that they cannot do at this moment because they don't have that scale. That's one thing. I think the smaller vessels give you more utility. They allow you to blank sail, to slow things down. You can't blank sail a big ship that's three-fourths full. It's much easier to blank sail, to cancel the sailing of a 10,000 TEU ship than a 24,000 TEU ship. I think there's a lot of logistics involved here, but you also get that scale of efficiency in a bigger ship you don't get in a smaller ship. It is just cheaper to haul cargo on a bigger ship. It goes on here. Shipping giants may have been canceling sailings for far longer than necessary in 2020, and it helped increase their rates. Olaf's response, does it have an impact on consumers on the price of maritime transport? Well, of course, is the question now, and especially since we've seen this huge increase in freight rates. It is difficult to prove, of course, that there's also why many competition authorities are looking into it, but they're also having difficulties finding, let's say, a smoking gun. It is a problem. It's hard to see this. There's no reason to sail a ship that's just going to be waiting off a terminal for 3, 4, 5 weeks. And it's better just to cancel the sail and just sell the cargo later in many cases. But we know that about 10% of the world container fleet is idle, just sitting, waiting to get in and out of ports right now, which is down from where it was, but it's still substantial. He goes on here, a lot of capacity was idle. So a lot of sailings were blanked in the spring and summer of 2020. That's true because freight was down. But if you look at freight rates, they started to go up in May and June of 2020. But it's actually only in September 2020 that the capacity was back to normal. I think that had a lot to do with not knowing where everything was going with COVID. I want to go ahead and jump ahead to here a little bit more. The smoking gun point is interesting because I think we all kind of picture that this sort of cooperation would happen in back rooms where these sort of collaborations are happening. What would be the expected smoking gun that authorities are looking for? What are authorities looking for that they haven't found evidence of so far? I don't know exactly what competition authorities have done behind closed doors. Nobody does. And that's always the big issue. We don't know what's happening, especially because these top 9 container companies are all offshore. I can see some of their statements and they've done some inquiries that are public, but I would be interested to know from these authorities if they looked into this kind of these episodes and have asked carriers simply, what is their explanation? And then if that makes sense. I think that's the big thing is querying the CEOs, the US representatives to the United States. What is the plan? What are you doing? And being public with that, more hearings, more public statements is great. They tend not to be that way. Going on here, victims of a global play. Would you say there's any country or any port authority that's doing it differently? On the carrier side, I know Zim is one of the carriers that's not in any sort of alliance. Zim is the number 10 emerging container line, really big one, Israeli, just really making a big play right now. The whole story is the story of bigger ports. There's a whole range of secondary and tertiary ports where actually the big carriers don't really go. So they're not really interested in those ports in a way. I think there's also a blessing. I think these are the ports that are more structured according to what the regional economy needs rather than being structured according to the wishes of a few global carriers. And he talks about the ports of Malaga in Spain and Toronto in Italy. And I think that's an issue we need to be talking about like this. Do we want all our ports in the United States catering to the big alliances and accommodating their larger and larger ships? Or do we want smaller secondary, tertiary ports? The problem is our ports are geared to fight each other, to fight for competition. And that's not really a good way to do it. Going on here, record profits and meager taxes for shipping giants. The thing I want to focus on here is a statement that he has right here, Olaf. I think an interesting element in this whole dynamic is the fact that they don't pay a lot of taxes. So it's essentially similar to what you mentioned about Amazon. There's a similar dynamic for shipping companies where they have managed to pull off some sort of race to the bottom when it comes to taxation. A lot of these shipping companies and also container shipment companies don't pay a lot of taxes. I think that is now becoming a little bit clearer and also becoming more flagrant. Now they're making these record profits that have an average tax rate of, wait for it, 2%. 2% in tax rates is what they're doing. Now, I want to see back up to where Olaf gets that number from, but that's a big issue. The fact that those taxes are being pretty low at this point. The last point he talks about here, and it deals with the findings from the FMC. Again, I'm going to do a whole video on this. This is the story right here. FMC's Rebecca Dye finds no evidence of collusion among the ocean carriers. The Federal Maritime Commission still could investigate numerous changes in ocean shipping. So the Federal Maritime Commission issued this report at the end of May on fact-finding investigation number 29. This looked at the period during COVID, where they did not find any evidence of collusion, of rate setting during that period. However, there are caveats in this report that are not being reported on enough, I think. What some people are sitting there saying is like, look, the ocean carriers are great. They're fantastic. They're doing exactly what we wanted them to do. Everything is well. But Commissioner Dye makes some very important caveats in this report where she talks about the fact is there are potential for issues in the future. Go back to here with Olaf. This raises the question of what is a concentrated market? And he uses this Herfindahl-Hirschman index, the HHI, which is used to determine whether there's highly concentrated efforts on routes. And basically, they have a way to determine this, where if you score more than 2,500 points on this system, you're highly concentrated. And it goes here, on many routes, there are hardly any independent carriers left. Those are carriers that do not operate in one of the three global alliances. Now, remember, you'll hear that there are independents on these routes. However, those independents are part of the alliance system. They're just operating not technically under the alliance. On the Trans-Pacific route, the market share of independent operators in 2021 was around 8%, considerably lower than in 2020 or in 2021. And I think that's the big issue that we're seeing here, is this concentration and built of power of the big container lines. They're growing, they're getting bigger, they're concentrating. Go back 10, 15 years, the top 10 container companies controlled 50%. Now it's almost 85%. And it's getting stronger. And one of the things we can expect to see with the change in COVID and port restrictions and things opening up is those container liners are going to want to drive out those little guys that have come in, grabbed a share of their service. And more importantly, they may be competing against each other to further consolidate and firm up their alliance and their capability. And again, they love operating these big, large, efficient ships because they cost less money per ton. They're great for their management system. They're less port charges, port fees, fuel, you name it. But again, what we're seeing right now, and you go back to Rachel's original story where she uses data from Vessel Finder, the ships that are the biggest right now, or the most numerous on order in terms of number of vessels and, more important, carrying capacity, are Neo-Panamax vessels, ships that can go through the new lane of the Panama Canal up to about 15,000 boxes. That's the butter zone where people are ordering the big ships. Remember, the big ultra large ships only operate on the Europe to Asia route. They don't come to the United States. They really don't. Some do, but the very few that you see right now, it's basically CMA, CGM that operates some of the big ones, but nearly all the other ones operate Europe to Asia. And again, that's because the European Commission basically gave the go-ahead from that. The Europeans built the ports to accommodate them, and off to the races you go. Now, if the US decides to open up for 24,000 box ships, We know that's going to be an issue when CMA, CGM, Benjamin Franklin came into LA in 2015. There was a lot of issues with that ship. They identified problems, and those problems have manifested themselves repeatedly during the supply chain crisis. So a really interesting story by Rachel Premack. I'm hoping, what I hope next is that Rachel goes the opposite end. Did a great interview with Olaf Merck, but I would go to the World Shipping Council and talk to them. Understand, the World Shipping Council has a lot of power. They're the trade organization for the large container liners. You talked about port consolidation on the West Coast. The entity that represents the West Coast ports is the PMA, the Pacific Maritime Association. The Pacific Maritime Association is made up of the shipping companies and the terminals. And so they have a lot of power over the West Coast ports. So they're the ones in negotiation with the ILWU, the workers' unions in those ports. So maybe an interview with the World Shipping Council or the PMA would be a nice balance, I think, to this. I think Rachel's doing a great job with this. I enjoyed this article. I think you take all off with a grain of salt, as always, like you do every article. There's always room for interpretation and questioning. And as always, I'll have all the sources in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's episode, and I hope you did, please subscribe to the channel, hit a bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, give it a thumbs up, share it across social media, and if you can, head on over to the Patreon page. Become a patron of the channel so that you can help support the channel as we endeavor to grow. Until our next video, this is Sal, signing off.